Hey guys, it's Fraser and welcome to my video presentation. Today we're going to be looking at contemporary coaching for the power clean. This presentation is titled The Effectiveness of a Constraints-Led Approach on Motor Learning and Its Influence on Skill Acquisition in the Power Clean. Now don't worry if you can't always see what's happening behind me or to the side of me. I will throw up a picture-in-picture of the slides from time to time, but it's important that you see I'm doing this in one take. Now, we have 15 minutes to cover a lot today. Right at the end, I'm going to show you some real-world examples of using a constraints-led approach to help both a new learner for the power clean, but also someone with a bit more experience on the power clean. Okay. Before we get there, we are going to look at skill acquisition broadly. Of course, we'll talk about the constraints-led approach and look at the theories that make up that approach. We'll then look at the skill of the power clean and traditional teachings of the power clean, as well as critiquing the traditional teachings, and then go on to contemporary coaching. So when we look at skill acquisition and movement, an easy umbrella to put over all this and something to remember is it's just like riding a bike. We'll get back to that, but it's like riding a bike. So when we look at skill acquisition, we've got neuroscience, experimental psychology, motor learning, motor control, okay? And when we look at motor control, there's a whole lot of theories that we need to talk about. Now, motor control is just interested in how the body controls mechanisms to produce movement. The theories that we'll talk about in particular, which are related to the constraints-based approach, is dynamic systems theory. We'll talk about degrees of freedom as well, and ecological theory. Now, suffice to say, you can have good control and poor control everywhere in between on that spectrum, and the process you go through is motor learning. Now, with motor learning, there's various theories as well. We'll look at schema theory in the next slide. Okay, Schmitz and Lee have defined motor learning as a set of processes associated with practice or experiences leading to relatively permanent changes in capability for movement. Alright, so you can't ride a bike, alright? You go through the process, you gain motor control, you go through the process, and then you can ride the bike. And then you can take 5, 10 or longer years without ever practicing or riding a bike, but you can jump back on after 10 years and more or less you've got good control. It might be a little bit harder as you're older on the old cardiovascular system, but you can execute the coordination to ride that bike. Okay, excuse me. Alright, let's talk about the constraints-led approach and the theories that make up the constraints-led approach. And the first is very task-based. It's the schema theory where it's very top-down and you create a set of rules which you will then extrapolate and take into another task or situation. That's what it is. So, for example, if I'm a skills coach for whatever reason, and I'm doing a 5-meter passing drill with someone that's absolutely new to rugby, and then we go and decide, okay, to do 15-meter passing drill, or we start to run and pass, then that learner, that young person is going to take the rules that made him or her successful in that 5-meter pass and try to apply it in the new task. Alright, so that's really what schema theory is looking at. Next is dynamic systems theory, which looks at humans as complex systems with complex subsystems, hormonal, neural, biomechanical. All right. It talks about degrees of freedom as well, so it's sort of a preface to constraints-led approach, and that learners will. There's so many different degrees of freedom the body has. Okay, so my elbow joint has 2, for example. My shoulder has 6. So if I go to throw a ball, there's 8 degrees of freedom. But wait a minute, I've also got my legs, my torso. There's lots of degrees of freedom. So sometimes learners will freeze degrees of freedom in order to achieve what they think is an efficient movement and exhibit movement control. Now we're going to talk about that a little bit later on when it comes to the power clean. The last one is ecological, which makes up this constraints-based approach. And that talks about the environment giving you affordances, giving you opportunities to take action. So an example might be you're an MMA fighter all of a sudden, don't know why, but you are, okay, and you are noticing that your opponent, when he throws a big kick, he's not protecting his jaw with his other hand, okay, so the environment is giving you the opportunity to neutralize that opponent because, you know, his jaw's exposed. However, the environment, as we know, is dynamic. So, for example, you know, round one's over, you go to the coaches give you, you know, catch your breath, give you some information, and you're coming out now, and your opponent, when he does his big signature kick, he's actually also protecting his jaw. So, you know, his leg's up here, then chinos, so I'm not even going to even try that. But suffice to say, the opportunity to really take advantage of this is gone, okay? So, the environment is dynamic, and that's an example. So, what is the constraints-led approach? It really is the manipulation of constraints, either task, organismic, or environmental, that allow for manipulation of coordination, which ultimately leads to better movement control. Alright, so manipulating a task, we're going to talk about that in my power clean examples a little bit later. Manipulating the human, the organismic side of things, that might be, for example, in a rugby setting, in a team sport setting, you know, players coming in for their heavy strength work, but the skill session that they did just before it ended up being maybe they're a winger and they had to do a lot of kick and chase, so maybe they're tired. Okay, that would be an example of a constraint, an organismic constraint. All right, maybe you're that MMA fighter again, and you've just finished round 2, but you come out and you've broken your thumb, so now you can't execute the punching style that you use, that skill that you're known for, and you have to figure out, that's your constraint, you have to figure out another way to execute that task, or maybe you change the task. And lastly, environmental constraints could be setting some loud music for the gym before you do your max lifting. It might be social environmental, so could be, you know, training groups, setting guys up in training groups where they're very, very competitive, and you know, that will influence a lot of things, but also potentially executing skills and trying new things and trying to be better. Okay, so essentially what we're saying again is that we can manipulate task, organismic or environmental, and put constraints on that, which will lead to better coordination and achieve the movement goal that we're trying to achieve. We can manipulate one, or we can manipulate all three, which Bosch talks about in his book. We don't have time to get into too much today. Alright, when we look at the power clean, we are talking about a closed and discrete skill, so there is a clear start and a clear end to the power clean. Alright, it's a velocity dependent movement, high coordination, and is used by a lot of strength and conditioning practitioners. However, there is a debate around the time it takes to learn such a complex skill versus getting a training stimulus with something else, just like, you know, squat jumps. Okay, and I do like Dan Cleather's response to that, where he says, you know, if it takes you a long time to teach the skill of power clean, it's not really an exercise problem, it's more of a coach problem. Okay, I always liked when I heard him say that. Now, the power clean, there's various stages of the power clean. Alright, we're going to assume a little bit of knowledge on the power clean in terms of bar path and what the body should look like, just because of the time constraint I have for this video. Let's look at the traditional coaching of the power clean, which assumes this sort of linear learning. So step 1, step 2, step 3, and that's how we learn, okay? That's what it assumes. So we might have heard you've got to earn the right. Earn the right to progress onto blah, blah, blah. Okay, and that might be true and very useful in some situations. I think in this situation, not so much. So if you look at this, the 6-step model proposed by these researchers, we want to learn the hang power clean. Here's how we're going to do it. The hang position, Romanian deadlift and front squat. Yes, you want to make sure that your athlete can achieve the position first. I really like the Exos philosophy of position, pattern and power. Of course that's really important, but how you learn that pattern and develop the power is key. So step 2 is the power shrug. So you've got to execute that. I'm happy with that. You're achieving triple extension, everything you want. Okay. Next is power shrug with row. Okay, so now you're achieving everything, you know, you're doing this, so that's good, that looks good, okay. Next is power shrug with row and catch, okay. Next is power shrug and catch, and then finally, once you're competent on all these different movements, you can then finally move on to practicing the hang power clean. So it's a bit of a long-winded way to get there when the athlete has shown they can achieve the start and end position. The problem with this is there is a skill decomposition. You're actually doing part practice, all right? So you're actually practicing other skills, like a row. A shrug and row is different from what it's going to be like when you do a hang power clean. Yes, you go through that pattern, but you're practicing other skills. There's skill decomposition there. You're not practicing the actual skill that you want to practice. It's very coach-centered. It's very dependent on me ticking the box, making sure I know when you're competent. You can do this, you can do that. Yes, and there's constant feedback, there's constant conversation. All right, it's very much a conductor and not gardener approach. Again, to quote Bosch. Okay, research shows that on research shows that on discrete skills, whole practice works really, really well. Okay, so you can practice this. If you want to power clean, you power clean with a discrete skill. If you want to squat, you squat with a discrete skill. Research supports that notion. All right, contemporary coaching assumes that learning is non-linear. Learning is non-linear. Okay, and again, I've got the quote in there from Bosch, and he talks about fluctuators and attractors, and we don't have time to get into that today, but suffice to say that the ethos there, the thinking behind that is you're trying to create constraints on task or environment or the person to facilitate learning. Right? You don't have to be there, and you're just setting it up in the right environment, putting the right constraints on it, and letting it grow, as opposed to you go now, we're doing this together, you know. Okay. Degrees of freedom we talked about, and I've got a real example for you now. So look at this young player freezing degrees of freedom on the power clean. So this is his first time working with me on the power clean, and this is, I think, his second set of reps on the power clean. So check the position. Okay, watch his elbows, alright? The position isn't perfect, but he's going through more or less, you know, the power clean, okay? So there's a couple of things that we need to tidy up, but watch his feet, please. You'll notice that he doesn't hit extension in the ankles, alright? He doesn't jump his feet out either. He's frozen this sort of lower half to try and achieve what he thinks is good movement for the power clean. And that's absolutely fine. It's an example of freezing degrees of freedom to just figure out the movement, alright? So, what constraint did we put on? What task constraint did we put on? Well, first of all, I wanted to address the elbows, the finish position. Said, okay, you've got to pause in the catch position. I just said you've got to pause here with your elbows up. Okay, you've got to count 4 seconds in your head. There's a task constraint for you. Alright, now, still freezing degrees of freedom here. Okay, but did you see how his elbows were down, and then in that 4 seconds he brought them up into that sort of elbow tricep parallel to the floor? Okay, so much better. That was a 2 second fix. Alright, another example of a task constraint on the power clean is 4 seconds to lift off, which I use to help the second pull. Now, I've not told this player anything about moving his feet out or anything like that. I just said 4 seconds before you jump. 4 seconds before you jump, okay? Take 4 seconds to get the bar before you jump, and watch what happens with his feet. You see how his feet are now moving in the pattern that we would like to see for a power clean. So he's got his feet underneath his hips, and then he gets into a wider base of support in the catch position. And look at the elbows, they're still fine. So this is set 3 or 4, I think we're 7 minutes into him being in the gym. So we've got the jump, we've got a much better shape. There's still things that we can tidy up, but just by putting in this example, this task constraint, like he's getting better really without thinking about it. He's self-organizing himself, alright? Here's an example of a player that always jumps forward. He's a number 10, 80 kilograms, this is 100 kilograms, and we can tidy up his first pull and transition phase of his power clean. I just told him stay on the mats. Stay on the mats. And you can see that he jumps his feet out instead of jumping forward to try and receive the bar. So he's self-organised, and he's tidied himself up. Now there's other things going on there that we could work on. like getting lower, but he actually recognises that, which is nice. Anyway, these are examples of putting constraints on the task, which then help influence coordination and achieve an improved motor control and better achieve the movement goal that we're trying to achieve. Right? So in conclusion, the constraints-led approach is an effective approach in teaching and refining the power clean. Okay, we've seen it in the videos here. We've also seen it in some modern research. All right, there are many roads that lead to Rome. Sometimes part practice might be important to go over, and of course, the traditional teaching has worked in the past. So there are many roads to lead to Rome, but the constraints-led approach is definitely effective in coaching the power clean. And coaches should try to be dynamic and athlete-centered to allow them to learn effectively, so you can grow that garden and not have to be there to conduct the music. Thank you very much for watching my video. See you on the next one.